Hey everyone. This video is going to be, in a pretty loose sense, a continuation of my last video, or maybe a reincarnation, if you will. If you haven't seen that one, I'd recommend pausing this to go watch it right now, not because it's in any way important to understanding this one, but just because I think it was pretty good. Also, YouTube pays me when I get people to watch ads. Now, in that video, I talked about a reality show called Lost Resort, which on its surface is about a bunch of people with very serious trauma going to a hippie resort, and instead of receiving help, it quickly devolves into just the show 9 Perfect Strangers.
9 strangers.
All those bitches better come at me with positive energy.
At their breaking point.
To me, I would never put you in danger.
We are gonna trigger the mother out of them.
But something that I didn't have time to talk about that was a bit subtler than the rampant abuse that the guests on the show were subjected to was the way that the show would often frame spiritual progress as being about optimizing yourself to be more successful. And that's a little strange, right? Like, I'm personally not religious at all, but the people who I know who are generally don't see their religion as a form of self-help. And while the New Age movement is absolutely not unique in this, it's not hard to find grifters pushing just about any religion, but it is a little bit odd that New Age spirituality is almost explicitly marketed as a form of self-help. In most bookstores, for example, the place you'll probably find New Age books is alongside How to Win Friends and Influence People, and, I don't know, a funnier book to name here. Oh my god, it's so hot in this room. I'm sweating like a freak! And so, today, we're gonna dig into how that happened. In this video, we're gonna talk about how the New Age movement turned capitalist.
In a dream you can't get out. You try to scream, you try to shout. Hold tight to someone near. Don't let go until
Before we do that, though, I'm getting kind of hungry. Do you want something to eat? Come on, let's go to the kitchen. So, if you've been watching the channel for a while, or just noticed anything about how I look, you know that I worked as a line cook for pretty much every job I had before YouTube. As someone who still loves to cook, I always want to improve my knife skills, and I know for a fact that the only way to do that is by buying a ridiculously expensive knife, which will magically make me be able to do the thing where you just chop something super quickly without losing a finger. This is true. I regularly check the website of a local knife store looking for sales, but never pull the trigger because I know that I'd never be able to look at myself in the mirror again if I spent the equivalent of a month's rent on a chef's knife, no matter how beautiful it may be. That's where this video's sponsor, Kamikoto, comes in. Kamikoto makes beautiful and affordable Japanese steel knives, and they sent me some to take a look at. These knives are made with real Japanese steel. They're used by Michelin star chefs all over the world. They're all individually inspected and come with a lifetime guarantee, and they come in this pretty ashwood box. They sent me the Kempeki knife set, which comes with a paring knife, a nikiri or vegetable knife, and I believe this one is called a sujihiki, which is for slicing meat and fish. Just saying, anti-Christmas is right around the corner, and this would be a perfect gift to give to someone while you burn a Christmas tree on June 25th. And best of all, Kamikoto has tons of sales going on right now, something which they would neither confirm nor deny being at all related to anti-Christmas, a holiday which they claimed isn't a thing. Blasphemy aside though, they're offering all viewers of my channel an additional $50 US off any purchase if you click the link in the description or use the promo code WE'REINHELL at checkout, saying that any viewers of mine, quote, need all the help they can get. Which I thought was nice of them to say. I decided to test them out by throwing together sort of a riff on a recipe from a restaurant that I used to work at, and oh man, they're so nice, dude. I really like the weight of them. They just feel really good, and obviously are just so sharp. I've got some rice cooking in the pot over there, doing some roasted red peppers, sauteing the sliced up Brussels sprouts with some aromatics and fish sauce. And then we've got tofu that I was just marinating in soy sauce and then threw into some cornstarch, which I'm gonna fry up. And we'll throw some peanuts on top at the end. Well, I burnt the shit out of the tofu because I wasn't paying attention. Turns out doing a cooking YouTube show is actually quite hard. Otherwise, not bad. Could use a bit more fat, I think. Like something a bit creamy would be good, but anyway. Once again, thank you so much to Kamikoto for sponsoring this video. If you are currently scrolling down to the comments to roast me for my shitty cooking, then consider clicking that link in the description or using the promo code WE'REINHELL at checkout to get $50 off of any purchase at kamikoto.com. Now, before we dig into this, something that I should note is that the fact that for a lot of people the New Age movement is synonymous with grifters and con artists is in part because most people on the inside don't actually call it the New Age movement at all. This is because, for reasons that we'll get into soon, the New Age movement has, from its very beginning, been a loosely associated collection of groups and belief systems, and so there's actually a lot of scholarly debate about what does and doesn't fall into the umbrella term New Age. What exactly is the definition of New Age? Well, it's like that old saying about pornography. Hard to define, but I delete it from my browser history. For instance, do people who are into UFOs count as New Age? I think a lot of people would probably say yes, but also, so do a lot of modern Wiccans, and those groups don't have the biggest overlap. What about neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, a pseudoscience based on concepts borrowed from psychology and neuroscience, which, through outdated or flat-out incorrect ideas about how the human brain works, claims to give its practitioners powers of persuasion and self-mastery that at times border on the supernatural. At this point, we're pretty far removed from healing crystals, but NLP does definitely fit the bill of New Age claims about alternative medicines releasing the hidden powers locked away inside each individual. Now, it's kind of tricky, right? Like, what about Scientology? What about yoga? Because New Age is such a broad category and the people in it don't use that term, some scholars have argued that we shouldn't either. I'm not going to claim to answer those questions here, but while I'm going to be more specific whenever I can be, I am just going to continue using it as a bit of a catch-all, which I think is fine as long as we're aware of those limitations. And so I'm about to dig into the history of the New Age movement, but seeing as scholars don't even agree on what does or doesn't qualify as part of that movement, I'm sure you won't be shocked to learn that the history is extremely murky as well. I'm going to do my best here to provide a condensed history, but I'm sure I'm going to leave out somebody's favorite weirdo, so I'm sorry. Also, this is going to be focused on the New Age movement in the Anglo Sphere, particularly England and America. There is a whole interesting history of the New Age movement in places that don't speak English, but it's just not within the scope of this video to cover all of them. I'll provide some links to resources in the description that you can check out if you're interested. Anyway, let's dive in. Part 1. Psychics and Scientists. While most people's image of the New Age movement comes from the hippies in the late 60s and early 70s, it goes back much further than that. What would eventually become the New Age movement has its roots in occultism. Western esotericism dates back to Gnostic groups at least as early as the 2nd century, but while these occult groups have been around basically forever, the history of them is very spotty. They pop up here and there, but the historical record of them, as well as the groups themselves, were heavily repressed by Christians. But when Western Christianity split during the Protestant Reformation, occult groups were able to worm their way out of the shadows and have had a presence in Western spirituality basically ever since. This started with Christian Kabbalism, and then other groups like the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, and of course the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as well as figures like Aleister Crowley and William Blake. By the way, a fun thing about me is that I was a pretty big nerd in high school, but also didn't even have any of the normal nerd interests. Like, I've never seen the original Star Wars movies. Instead, when I was a teenager, I got into something much lamer, which was learning about occult secret societies. So, if you don't know who the groups or people I just mentioned are, that's basically how I feel whenever people start talking about Jedis or whatever. Now who's ruining the vibe by showing up to Comic-Con dressed as Robert Anton Wilson? Anyways, most of these groups died out during the Enlightenment, but had a big resurgence in the period between the First and Second World War. This was an interesting time. While it's kind of known as a downer, what with the Great Depression and the grappling with the horrors of the First World War, there was a lot of optimism then and a lot of excitement for the future. There was this strong belief that the worst atrocities that mankind was capable of were well behind us, never to be repeated, and people believed that by divorcing themselves from the past, they could take society in bold new directions, both culturally in the form of modernist avant-garde art, which was flourishing at the time, or through bold new political projects like the League of Nations, as well as socialism and fascism. Finally, there was a strong current of millennialism, and I don't mean avocado toast and crippling student loans. Basically, all New Age movements have to believe in the coming of a new age. Millennialism is essentially belief or a fixation on a decisive end of the world as we know it, and a belief in a new world that'll follow it. There's a heavy religious element to this, particularly in Christianity, but it's also been a part of more secular social movements such as socialism and Nazism. The Third Reich literally referred to the coming of a new third age. But also, this time was when we first started to really see the dominance of Protestantism wane, as new alternative religions started to sprout up. The first of these was spiritualism. In England, this developed in the trenches of World War I, as well as back home, where memorials to soldiers were everywhere. With so much death all around them, people started to get weird with religion. Instead of standard Christianity, they started to dredge up and practice old superstitions. This is where we get the contemporary Western practice of things like astrology, palm reading, and mediums. Spiritualism became extremely popular, and by the 20s there were around 250,000 practicing spiritualists and 2,000 spiritualist societies in the UK alone. Books were published like The Book of Fortune Telling, How to Tell Character and the Future by Palmistry, Cards, Numbers, Phrenology, Handwriting, Dreams, Astrology, etc., which promised the reader,
"You are quite sure to be in demand at all parties and gatherings if you can put on a mysterious air and read the future."
Sorry, Barfbag Johnson, your keg stands may be legendary, but we found a new king of the party. He puts on mysterious airs. By the way, that's gonna be one of the most normal books I talk about in this video. While spiritualism was based heavily off of very old superstitions, it also drew from that occult tradition that I just mentioned. While today we think of Kabbalah and Aleister Crowley as appealing mainly to wealth criminal perverts and a couple guys in dragon shirts who smell like incense and cats, spiritualism became popular mostly with the working class. Instead, the upper and middle classes got into the significantly more hipstery Theosophy movement. Theosophy arguably began with a woman named Madame Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine. It drew heavily from Eastern religions like Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism, and attempted to integrate them into Western spiritualism. Theosophists were generally much more well-off and tend to be supporters of progressive social movements like women's suffrage and Indian liberation. Instead of one movement, Theosophy splintered off into a bunch of different groups. Some of these were smaller reading groups who'd meet at occult bookstores like Atlantis in London, where the owner, Michael Houghton, led a group that he called the Order of the Hidden Masters in rituals in his shop's basement, while others formed larger organizations like the Buddhist Lodge of the Theosophical Society, which played a role in bringing Buddhism to England. Alan Watts, who went on to massively influence the Beatniks, got his start here as the editor of the Buddhist Lodge's journal. A big part of why Theosophy got big was because of an influx of Indian religious leaders coming to visit Western countries around that time. People like Gandhi, Meher Baba, and Jiddu Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti became particularly influential as the leader of the largest Theosophy group of all, called the Order of the Star of the East. Originally, despite their differences, spiritualism and Theosophy were actually cool with each other, viewing what they were both doing as essentially different paths to the same common goal. The psychologist Carl Jung, for instance, was heavily influenced by both Theosophy and spiritualism, drawing on both his study of astrology and the I Ching for his early work. Get you a man who can do both. But this didn't last for long. While both groups presented themselves as trying to achieve a scientific understanding of spirituality, the Theosophists were a fair bit better at this. Around this time, there was an explosion of writing aimed at this new demographic, including books like Ron Lando's God is My Adventure, a book on modern mystics, masters, and teachers, as well as journals and magazines like The Shrine of Wisdom, Proteus, and biggest of all, The Occult Review, which ran for just over 50 years. As the religious scholar Stephen Sutcliffe writes,
a typical interwar issue included articles on astral travel, occult sources of healing, commentaries on Eastern religious texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, interpretations of karma and reincarnation, and profiles of contemporary gurus. Advertisement pages included local groups and societies and services, such as astrology and clairvoyance.
While the journal would cover Theosophy and spiritualism, its coverage of spiritualism mostly involved debunking fake psychics, which, cool, but that would definitely mean a lot more coming from a paper that didn't also claim astral projection was totally legit. This guy claimed to be able to speak to my dead relatives, yet when I visited the spectral plane, nobody had even heard of him. Now, let's take a dive into the actual ideologies of these movements. First of all, it's worth noting though that while there are exceptions, in general the people practicing Theosophy were more interested in the exotic aesthetic of these Eastern religions than they were in their actual messages. The big difference being that while a lot of these religions emphasize a coexistence between man and nature, viewing all of us as being part of the same natural system that it is our duty not to interrupt, both spiritualism, Theosophy, and most of the New Age movement that would come out of these tend to view things in a way that's much closer to transcendentalism, a religious movement that developed out of Unitarianism in New England around the early 1800s. Probably the most famous of the early transcendentalists was a pretty rad guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was basically kicked out of Unitarianism for his famous Divinity School address, where he argued, among other things, that the Bible should be read metaphorically and that the crucifixion of Christ should be understood as him experiencing ego death. That said, where transcendentalism differs from these Eastern religions is that instead of seeing humans as part of nature, transcendentalists believe that people are distinctly different from everything else in that, while, they argue, God is the life force that exists in everything, we have just more God in us than anything else does. Transcendentalists don't advocate for living harmoniously with nature, but instead for using nature to further perfect ourselves in order to eventually become gods, or as close to that as possible. Another big influence on what would become the New Age movement was Enlightenment ideology, through which the occult movement moved to a more scientific view of their practices. This involved a shift to an impersonal view of God. Instead of an old guy in the clouds, the divine started to be viewed as a mysterious force or law of the universe. This also led to an idea of God as being beyond human comprehension. On a practical level, this led to them no longer trying to communicate with God, but other metaphysical beings that were seen to be closer to our level of reality, like angels, spirits, and so-called ascendant masters. When it comes to spiritualism and theosophy, Sutcliffe describes their rise as both being new post-Protestant religions. These movements, while being generally anti-Christian, called on their followers to sample from a wide range of religions, seeing themselves as enlightened seekers, unlocking their deep hidden potential by searching for truth wherever they may find it.
In sum, the charismatic but hidden powers of the individual, in a reanimated cosmos, were the common features of non-official religions in the interwar period. Theosophy and spiritualism helped to popularize an ideology of spiritual development in the face of what H.G. Wells called the present wide discredit of organized religions. The preferred religious role was no longer member, congregant, or communicant, but seeker.
Important, too, was that these were explicitly meant to be disorganized religions. Large congregations and communities were unnecessary, and instead, the closest they got would be small clubs or reading groups in bookstores, but often not even that was necessary, since they viewed the world of the mind as a literal physical place. And so, seekers were taught to see their own private spiritual development as itself praxis for a broader movement. This was a version of collective action that could be accomplished without ever talking to another person or even leaving your bedroom. So basically imagine online politics, except if the internet existed entirely in your imagination. Finally, we have one of the most influential contributors from this time period, Alice A. Bailey. Bailey was born in 1880 into a wealthy family in Manchester and grew up extremely Anglican. This changed when she encountered theosophy in California, an experience she described as the opening of a new spiritual era in her life. She became the editor of their magazine, but then around 1919, she claimed to have made contact with a master, a spirit named Jwal Kul, who she referred to as the Tibetan. The concept of masters in occult circles is that they are either living or disembodied beings who are God-realized and whose goal is to help humanity move forward through spiritual development. Also, there's a funny thing that happens a lot where anytime someone in any of these movements claims that they were contacted by some type of entity, everyone in whatever group that they were a part of thinks that they're crazy and kicks them out, and then they wind up forming their own organization. And that's exactly what happened with Alice Bailey. After making contact with the Tibetan, Bailey started a series of organizations, both occult, like the Arcane School, World Goodwill, and Triangles, as well as the political organization Men of Goodwill, which advocated for the, by then discredited, League of Nations to be replaced by the United Nations, which she believed would represent people from all walks of life and bring about world peace. Haven't looked into whether that was achieved yet, so please don't spoil it in the comments. But what makes Bailey significant here is that she took theosophy and these kinds of utopian millennialist political projects and added a whole lot of Jesus to the mix. Prior to her, the New Age movement was deeply critical of Christianity, but Bailey instead rejected some parts of Christianity, like the orthodoxy and aspects of the organization, but kept lots of it too, regularly emphasizing that the New Age will be a return of Christ, or that it'll involve people coming to live as Christ did, saying things like,
"The Christ is being born today in many a human being."
Or that
no man has ever been saved by theology, but only by the living Christ.
And
there will be a pouring in of light upon mankind, which will alter his conditions of living and change his outlook upon world affairs. This advent of Christ may take the form of an actual physical coming, or a tremendous inflow of the Christ principle.
Just guy who's never read anything except for the New Testament reading Buddhist philosophy. Like, Oh yeah, I'm getting some real New Testament energy off of this. Finally, prior to Bailey, the Theosophy movement was fairly egalitarian in their earlier political projects, advocating for pretty radical amounts of democracy. Bailey changed that. She didn't think that everyone would get this Christ consciousness, but only an elite chosen few. In 1934, she wrote a treatise on white magic, where she described the elite few who would achieve Christ consciousness as a new group who would gain things like
a universal touch, an intense sensitivity, a highly organized mental apparatus, and astral equipment responsive to the higher spiritual vibrations, a powerful and controlled energy body, and a sound physical body.
What Bailey's work ultimately did was both make Christianity a part of Theosophy and also establish Theosophy and the movements and theories that would follow it as hierarchical organizations where only a few chosen elite could achieve true enlightenment. Now, let's zoom out a little bit. While for good reason, when we think about the 1930s, we think about the Great Depression, but something that's important to note was that some people were actually enjoying an economic boom then. In England, for those who were lucky enough to keep a salaried job, there was an explosion in home ownership as well as new consumer goods. As Chris Cook and John Stevenson write,
alongside the pictures of dole queues and hunger marches must be placed those of another Britain, of new industries, prosperous suburbs, and a rising standard of living. For many salaried people, affluence began not in the 1950s, but in the 30s, when it became possible for an average, salaried person to buy his own house, usually on a mortgage, run a car, and begin to afford a range of consumer durables and household goods hitherto considered quite out of reach.
Sutcliffe argues that Bailey's contributions made Theosophy more appealing to the sensibilities of the salaried middle class. This is where we see the real significance of Theosophy, in helping change the function of religion away from enforcing traditional communities and towards legitimizing the identities of those in the newly emerging bourgeois class. Thanks to this new spiritual identity, members of this upper and middle class were no longer atomized. They were seekers. Instead of feeling powerless in the face of rising totalitarianism and a Second World War, they could now find agency by viewing their personal spiritual journey as the greatest adventure of all. But let's fast forward a little bit now to the second and worst smelling version of the New Age movement, with Part 2, the hippies. The hippie New Age movement, which people are probably most familiar with, took place in the late 60s to early 70s. The hippie movement was a bit of a blended up mix of a bunch of vaguely related progressive and countercultural movements from that time. Basically the green smoothie of social movements. These included the early environmental movement, which also advocated for things like communal living, vegetarian and vegan diets, and pacifism, which is where this intersected with the anti-war movement. All of these were not just advocated for as a good unto themselves, but also as a form of rebellion and nonconformism, which is where this in turn intersects with the beatniks and a ton of rock music from that time, as well as the psychedelic drug culture. The New Age movement became the dominant spirituality behind the hippies, but remember that occultism and the New Age are an understanding of spirituality as a science, and so as science developed and became more sophisticated, so too did the occult. This isn't to say that the old weird stuff went away. Bogus health claims, appropriate Eastern mysticism, and astrology are their bread and butter after all, baby. I mean, just the term New Age comes from the idea of the dawning of the age of Aquarius, an astrological theory that every 2,000 or so years the sun enters a different constellation, and then they believe in a concept called a great year, which, yeah, right, when was the last time we had one of those? But at this point, we aren't dealing with theosophy anymore. This isn't your grandma's interwar period New Age, chump. This is the post-war New Age movement. Get ready for some motherfucking expressivism. Expressivism is basically the idea that once all the corrupting forces of society and ego or whatever are stripped away, your innermost self is fundamentally, objectively good, because it's an expression of God. Basically, you are God. All of life's problems then are based in external structures, and so what matters is removing those impediments that the ego has put up, either through psychology, spiritual training, or by retreating into nature. This also makes it a fairly anti-consumerist philosophy, since basing your life on accumulating possessions is a pretty clear-cut ego move. Finally, this also means that ethics come from within, by trusting your gut. Your innermost self is always, by definition, good and correct, so not only do you not need to look to external sources, they are actively suspect. The religious scholar Paul Heelis notes,
"Perfection, it is maintained, cannot be found by tinkering with what we are by virtue of socialization. Neither can it be found by conventional, political, etc. attempts at social engineering. Perfection can be found only by moving beyond the socialized self, widely known as the ego, but also as the lower self, intellect, or the mind, thereby encountering a new realm of being. It's what we are by nature. Indeed, the most pervasive and significant aspect of the lingua franca of the New Age is that the person is, in essence, spiritual. To experience the self is to experience God, the goddess, the source, Christ, consciousness, the inner child, the way of the heart, or most simply, and I think most frequently, inner spirituality. And experiences of the higher self, to use another favoured term, stand in stark contrast to those afforded by the ego. The inner realm, and the inner realm alone, is held to serve as the source of authentic vitality, creativity, love, tranquility, wisdom, power, authority, and all those other qualities which are held to comprise the perfect life."
Heelis calls basically anything based in expressivism a self-religion. These can vary in lots of ways. Some will focus on Freudian or more often Jungian ideas. Others focus on ritual magic and Wiccan beliefs, using crystals and shit. There's also a lot of variation in terms of how much they believe in an external god, if they do so at all. This is where you get people saying things like God is everywhere, or talking about the universe as basically a stand-in for God. But regardless, all of them mainly focus on the idea that God is inside of you. A lot of this was drawn from what were at the time cutting-edge psychological theories, and Heelis points out that most self-religion rituals were literally just basic exercises stolen from expressivistic psychology.
Indeed, many of the processes employed by self-religions are drawn from the world of popular psychotherapies. Role-playing exercises, catharsis, guided imagery, confrontational techniques, and so forth are utilised. Those familiar with paths such as transactional analysis, primal therapy, encounter, psychodrama, or Gestalt recognise much of what's going on.
Heelis argues that expressivist psychologists and self-religions only really differ in that psychologists generally just claim that these techniques would help with whatever issues you had, whereas the self-religions would claim that they could turn you into Neo in the Matrix. Except usually not trans. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, the New Age movement enjoyed its biggest boom as it became attached to the hippie movement. But why did that happen? According to a study done in 1975, 16% of British people described themselves as hardcore self-explorers. Rules. They're just like, yeah, since my last breakup, I've been doing a lot of self-exploration every night around, 2 a.m. What's that? Oh, meditation. No. But that is pretty weird, right? I know that hippie culture is now kind of tied in all of our collective imaginations to the New Age movement, but first of all, 16% of the population being extremely open to the idea that they are God is weird. Imagine being at an average-sized house party and 4 to 6 people there are like, yeah, we are intrinsically infallible. So I guess just imagine a house party right after someone shows up with cocaine. But also, though, none of the cultural currents that went into making the hippies are particularly religious. Some of the beat writers were into occult or transcendental stuff, but that wouldn't account for all of this. So what was going on? One theory is called the rustled cage hypothesis. The idea is that when an individual is rattled by the conditions they're living under, they stop feeling at home in the external world and start to look inward. I don't think this is totally wrong at all, but also, I think we can maybe question how rattled these people really were. While a big chunk of the hippies in general were white, college-educated boomers from the middle class, this was even more so the case with the New Agers. That definitely doesn't mean that they didn't experience hardships in any ways, but like, they had it pretty fucking good. Another theory that Helis puts forward is that society wasn't meeting people's spiritual needs of fulfillment or identity, what with all the alienation of industrial capitalism and the logics of technologies being imposed onto people's lives and psyches. And so, people started to look inward instead. The hippies sought out a way to rebel and find the things that they couldn't get from institutional religion, and they turned to alternative spirituality. This fits with Sutcliffe's theory that New Age spirituality became a source of bourgeois identity. But then in the mid-70s, the party ended with the recession. Economic turbulence has a way of forcing a counterculture into the mainstream. All the hippie boomers who were happy to drop out and join a commune or travel to India now need to start taking showers again and get real jobs. And from here, the hippies and with them the New Age movement died out. Except Part 3. Angels in Pinstripes. The 80s saw a third wave of the New Age movement, and I would argue that that's the one that we're still in today. And oh man, this is where shit gets weird. Those old hippies who grew up and got big boy jobs didn't abandon the New Age movement, right? Instead, they brought it with them into the boardroom. This was nothing new, since the New Age movement had always been involved in business in some ways. For instance, one figure who came out of the interwar period who I hadn't mentioned yet is Napoleon Hill, an absolute con man who would claim to teach people how to use the power of magnetism to become better salesmen. This went on to form quite possibly the grossest manifestation of the New Age movement, New Thought. This is where we get shit like The Secret. It's the prosperity gospel with crystals and incense. New Thought claims that people decide their own reality by attracting things that they want and repelling what they don't. While the con artists who rip people off with these classes are terrible, terrible people, I'm not going to focus on that too much here. If you are interested in that, James Janney made a great series on a lot of the scammers involved in New Thought. I'd also recommend Thought Slime's video about Gary Vaynerchuk to learn about how New Thought connects to modern day hustle culture. But instead, I'm going to talk about a much darker aspect of this ideology. While this isn't exactly an advertised part of their beliefs, since New Thought thinks that you can attract wealth and success basically just by wishing for them, they also believe that anyone who is, for instance, born into poverty subconsciously chose that too. A good example of this is Shirley MacLaine, an actress who became extremely interested in the New Age movement and played a role in popularizing it through the series of books that she wrote about her spiritual development. In them, she writes about how she believes that she chose every aspect of her life, including her parents.
I had been responsible for choosing to see everything I had seen, doing everything I had done. I had drawn to myself the people and events of all my lives in the long, slow, ongoing process of bringing myself. I had chosen these two as parental figures this time around.
Let's take a quick detour now to see the horrifying logical conclusion of this ideology. For anyone not familiar with her, Carolyn Borisenko is a right-wing grifter. She first burst onto the scene with a PragerU video about why she left the left, where she says that she used to be a liberal, but a Facebook knitting group that she was a member of was mean to her, and then she went to a Trump rally and everyone was nice, and so from there she apparently completely changed all of her political views. Just absolute baby brain shit. I like imagining her walking around living her life just completely falling under the sway of the last person who shows her the slightest amount of kindness. Anyways, one day, Borisenko tweeted her take on abortion. I assume that she was trying to thread the needle of being pro-choice while also conservative. Here's how that turned out.
I believe that everyone always chooses to live or die. Everyone. Always. Aborted children choose to be aborted. If they choose to be born into human form in the future, they can. So no, I do not agree with the statement because I do not have a Christian worldview.
Just saying that she's pro-choice because she doesn't think murder is bad. At first I assumed that she was always a conservative, but now I actually do think that she's dumb enough that some strangers being nice to her once would completely flip her political views. If you're trying to get in contact with Carolyn, I assume that you can find her in an alley somewhere losing games of tic-tac-toe to a chicken. Anyway, someone asked her if she would apply the same argument to people who died in a drone strike. Like, do they also choose to die? And she said,
yes, they do. Everyone who died in the Holocaust chose to die in the Holocaust before they were ever born, because they collectively wanted to understand the experience of ultimate oppression. That's why Hitler went to heaven.
Holy fucking shit, right? I want to be clear here that this is absolutely the logical conclusion of New Thought, but where most people would bring up an argument like that as a dunk, Carolyn's just like, nope, that's actually my belief. Nobody even tried to corner her into bringing up the Holocaust. She decided to do that herself. I don't know, if I'm being generous, maybe she was just trying to score points with her conservative audience and thought that this is what people meant when they say that they're anti-mask. But anyways, there's lots of other ways in which the New Age movement has been involved in corporate management. All of them horrifying. For instance, back in the 50s, well before Timothy Leary was giving acid to his students and celebrity friends, the writer Gerald Heard, believing that society would be advanced by an enlightened upper echelon of spiritual leaders, was trying to help this process along in the absolute lamest way possible, by getting CEOs to take LSD to make them more productive. Another example is one of the biggest New Age communities in the UK, Findhorn, in northern Scotland. Founded by Peter and Aline Caddy, Findhorn was originally a commune where, in spite of the shitty soil that they had to work with, they wound up growing massive vegetables, which they attributed to supernatural forces. The commune was later joined by David Spangler, a follower of the teachings of Alice Bailey, who, by the 70s, moved Findhorn away from agriculture and winning largest pumpkin contests, and towards offering classes based around personal development, eventually turning it into a corporate retreat, which it still is to this day. In America, too, they had more or less their own version of Findhorn in Esalen, a retreat located on Big Sur that offered expensive courses for management types, teaching them to, like, meditate and shit, as seen in the final episode of Mad Men. But while upper management has been going to yoga retreats and learning about Zen and the art of Excel, lower-level employees have been subjected to straight-up cult shit. A big influence on this is Werner Erhard, arguably the father of modern self-help. Erhard pioneered a lot of this throughout the 70s with a lecture technique he created called EST, short for Erhard Seminars Training. These lectures were, in a word, fucked, as Mark Brewer describes.
They, the trainees, were present. He, the trainer, roared in command voice, because their lives did not work. Their lives were shit, hopeless. They did not know what they were doing, did not know how to experience life. They were struggling, desperate, confused. They were assholes.
This was also heavily influenced by the New Thought movement. Helis describes someone who went to one of these seminars for her job as a door-to-door salesperson who said,
"If no one was home, it was because you weren't home."
Several of these training seminars, such as ones run by Landmark Education International and another by Block Trainings, have been accused of brainwashing and just being cults. At the beginning of Block's 5-day retreat, they would require participants to hand over their phones, passports, car keys, and watches, and would not allow them to talk to each other for the entire time. But why did this happen? The fact that a lot of corporate executives used to be hippies doesn't explain all of this. If it did, then corporate attire today would be rave pants and scene haircuts. There's something else going on. One reason is that in the 80s, companies were taking note of the massive economic growth of the so-called Asian tigers, places like Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, and trying to emulate them. This growth was largely due to these places being given massive amounts of foreign investment capital in order to prevent them from becoming communists, which they then used to rapidly industrialize. But Western companies just figured that it was because of their Zen management style, whatever that means, and then tried to copy that by, making their employees take a meditation class. It's also worth pointing out the relationship between occultism and psychology. As you may have noticed, the two have been orbiting and feeding off of one another for this entire story. Likewise, psychology has been deeply involved in the business world too, specifically in the science of management. For example, Henry Ford had his managers observe the family lives of his employees in order to devise new and more effective disciplinary tools. At the same time, Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, was applying his uncle's theories to create advertising as we know it today. We can also see this with someone like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, an Indian yoga guru known for popularizing transcendental meditation, as well as for being the spiritual guru for both the Beatles and the Beach Boys. His followers also went on to form the Maharishi University of Management in Fairfield, Iowa, offering MBAs to students of transcendental meditation. There's also the work of Wilhelm Reich. In his 1927 classic, The Function of the Orgasm, Reich argues that in order for someone to be healthy, both mentally and physically, they need to come regularly. He argued that lack of orgasms was the cause of basically all illnesses. This probably unsurprisingly led to him breaking ties with the Psychiatric Association and instead going on to be a big figure in alternative healing and the New Age in general. Once free from big psychology, he went on to develop the science of orgonomy, the study of organs, or the basic unit of sexual and cosmic energy, which he believed to be essentially our life force, a lack of which causes all illnesses.
The discovery of orgone energy was made through consistent, thorough study of energy functions, first in the realm of the psyche, and later in the realm of biological functioning.
I'm gonna be honest with you, Wilhelm Reich doesn't really relate to the point I'm making, he just rules. This connection to both the New Age and the world of business is present with lots of contemporary psychology as well. A good example of this is emotional intelligence. The main preacher of this, aside from Discord groomers, is Daniel Goleman, a practicing Buddhist who developed this theory pretty much purely for companies to make better hiring decisions. But there's another theory, and to understand it, we have to first zoom out and look at the economic landscape. That's right, you knew we'd get to it sooner or later. We're talking about neo-fucking-liberalism. Between the end of the second New Age movement and the start of the third, a lot changed. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were elected, and what was once a completely fringe movement became the world's dominant economic paradigm. The founders of which, Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, won Nobel Prizes in economics for their work in 1974 and 1976, respectively. Neoliberalism is broadly based on the following principles. 1. State control of society should be minimized. 2. The market should be allowed to operate freely. 3. People tend to act rationally and with self-interest. 4. Anything that violates the individual's rights is inherently unfair. 5. Those rights should be negatively defined, i.e. you have the freedom from not being able to start a business or whatever, not the freedom to, for instance, have access to food and shelter. And finally, 6, capitalist society is fundamentally harmonious, meaning that there are no conflicting interests, especially not between capital and labor. But like I said, while this is basically the status quo right now, this was a massive shift. And so instead of everyone just jumping on board, a PR battle had to be waged. The Swedish author Lars Ahlin notes how in Sweden, in order for neoliberalism to take hold, the conservative newspaper Svenska Dagbladet Dagblad? The conservative newspaper SVD became the main mouthpiece for this ideology right around the start of the 80s, but at the same time, SVD began to publish a ton of New Age articles as well, creating an entire women's section of the paper, which was literally pretty much entirely New Age stuff. So, what's going on here? To understand this, we're going to look at one of the most famous theories in all of sociology, the concept of the Protestant work ethic, which was laid out by the German sociologist Max Weber in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. In the book, Weber argues that certain aspects of Protestantism make it particularly suited for capitalism. He points to Protestants' belief that it is predetermined if you'll go to heaven or hell, and so Protestants place a great deal of emphasis on people exhibiting the traits that they believe are signs that you're getting into heaven, namely hard work and frugality. Weber argues that this is why majority Protestant countries in Europe were first to adopt capitalism. This has been pretty widely criticized for failing to mention that when capitalism started, people actually weren't stoked about it regardless of whether or not they were Protestant. Rather than people just jumping on board, capitalism was violently imposed through a bloody process called primitive accumulation. So, scholars have spent about 100 years now researching to what extent Weber was right or wrong, and there are much smarter people than me on both sides of this. I am absolutely not familiar with all of the research on this topic, but my general understanding is that while Weber absolutely overstated the causal impact of Protestantism, there is evidence that once capitalism was imposed, Protestants seemed like they were quicker to get with the program. By the way, if I can come to the defense of some old dead white men real quick, this is something that always bugs me about the way that people will talk about these kinds of foundational thinkers. Plenty of the specific claims and predictions that were made by people like Weber, Marx, Freud, and whoever have been proven wrong or didn't come true, but the reason we still study them is because of the questions that they were asking, not the answers that they gave. The theory of the Protestant work ethic is interesting and important in its own right, but the reason people still study that book isn't to learn about the spread of capitalism, but because in it, Weber develops a theory to analyze the way that the meanings people impose on mundane actions affects how they do them. Anyways, in spite of, or actually honestly probably in part because of the shortcomings of Weber's theory, the Protestant work ethic has been widely accepted to be the guiding morality behind industrial capitalism, to the point where sometimes people will describe things as Protestant when they just mean capitalist. Now, while taking Weber with a grain of salt, I think that there is a compelling argument for how the New Age movement serves a similar role in neoliberalism as Protestantism did in industrial capitalism. Allen lays out a series of principles of New Age thought that fit pretty nicely with neoliberalism. Like neoliberalism, the New Age movement emphasizes the importance of the individual, specifically believing that the individual decides their own reality and is responsible for their own life, as we saw with New Thought. The individual should rely on their own authority, as was emphasized with expressivism, and that individual has tremendous potential just waiting to be unlocked. The figure of the individual is also placed in opposition to that of the establishment. The establishment is inherently evil because it refuses to recognize the supremacy of the individual. The New Age movement also places a lot of emphasis on the idea of consensus rather than conflict. This sounds fine in principle, but the problem lies in the idea that any conflict arises out of delusions of the ego. We're all one people, man. Why can't we all just get along? Workers, managers, owners, we all just want the same thing at the end of the day, right? This, of course, ignores the fact that plenty of people in society have genuinely competing interests, and instead fits into the neoliberal frame that capitalist society is inherently harmonious. One of the things that's odd about this, though, is that the New Age movement was, for all of its many flaws, pretty deeply anti-consumerist. If material wealth is seen as a distraction created by the ego, how does that fit with capitalism? Well, this is fixed with some good old-fashioned prosperity gospel New Thought bullshit. It's basically Protestant predeterminism all over again. It's not that you get into a business to make a ton of money. No. Your motives are completely pure. But the fact that you're making tons of money must be evidence that you're doing the right thing. Otherwise, the universe wouldn't have rewarded you. Wrapping up now, let's get to the core of how I think the New Age movement functions in society. In Jeremy Carrot and Richard King's book, Selling Spirituality, The Silent Takeover of Religion, they argue that neoliberalism has led to
an erasure of the wider social and ethical concerns associated with religious traditions and communities, and the subordination of the religious and the ethical to the realm of economics, which is now rapidly replacing science, just as science replaced theology in a previous era as the dominant mode of authoritative discourse within society. In this process, religion was rebranded as spirituality in order to enhance work, productivity, performance, and efficiency.
This relates to one of Margaret Thatcher's most famous quotes. In an interview in 1987, she said, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." The problem, though, with this is that for all of her social conservatism, the family unit and religion weren't very individualistic at all. This is where the New Age movement came in. While religion involved a community, dare I say, society, New Age spirituality is an individual quest. Part of why so many companies are so happy to integrate into their business is because now your office is your family. When you look past any of the kooky teachings, that's what's at the core of the New Age movement, replacing the community of religion with the atomization of spirituality. Now, before I go, one thing I should very much say here is that all of this should absolutely not be taken as me advocating for organized religion instead. There is plenty that's wrong with that too, but I think something that's missed by a lot of its critics is that it does do something. People need a community to belong to. I think at least one alternative to going back to organized religion is going back instead to something that's been oppressed almost as much as Christianity in America: organized labor. I was talking to a friend of mine who's currently trying to unionize Uber Eats in Toronto. Check out Gig Workers United, by the way, link in the description. He talked about one of the guys who's organizing with them, who's this old conservative guy who isn't even particularly a fan of organized labor, but joined them because he needed some type of company. I think it's something worth thinking about, that people need some form of community, and a union is a way better one than company-mandated orgone crystals. Thanks for watching.
This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, age of Aquarius, Aquarius, Aquarius. Harmony and understanding, sympathy and trust abounding. No more falsehoods or derisions, golden living dreams of vision. Mystic crystal revelation, and the mind's true liberation. Aquarius, Aquarius. When the moon the dawning of the age of Aquarius, age of Aquarius, Aquarius. Sunshine.